Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session on cybersecurity and the operational technology world. My name is Steven Seiden. I'm the president of Acquired Data Solutions. We are a 23-year-old engineering company that has been brought into the cybersecurity world by our customers because now their products have to be secure and they have to be tested, and cybersecurity has now become one of the key components to the engineering lifecycle. With me this afternoon is also Leighton Johnson and Tony Barber. Leighton, and Tony, would you like to take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Leighton Johnson. I have over 40 years experience in computer security, IT, and the various different cybersecurity areas. I've spent the last 25 years working in evaluation and testing of a variety of different types of systems in order to make sure that they are being operated safely and securely.
And hello, I'm Dr. Tony Barber. I'm a system engineering executive. Over 20 years in systems engineering, focused on enabling mission operations and a keen focus in cybersecurity and IT.
Great, thanks guys. Today we're going to cover a few things about the risk management framework and how it aligns with the DoD initiatives, talk about how we can streamline cybersecurity activities within your organization, how we can create the cybersecurity plan for operational technologies like Flight Fest, which we're going to talk about today, and go through the cybersecurity posture, and then talk about how we can prioritize and down select security controls for implementing the controls in your organization and your products. What is operational technology? I think we can think of operational technology really around critical infrastructure and the things that we do every day, whether it's water or gas or wastewater, and things that we rely on to make sure that they're safe for us. And it's both hardware and software, and it's, like I said, in manufacturing, transportation, and utilities. So we're going to really talk today about how OT relates to IoT and talk about systems, their security boundaries, assessments, countermeasures, and focus some of the conversation around flight tests, whether it's onboard avionics, mission computing, ground computing, maintenance, and test equipment.
All right, so as part of this process, NIST put together initially approximately 10 years ago the construct of what we now call the Risk Management Framework, or RMF. The idea was to evaluate at that time IT systems, now both IT and OT systems, in order to ensure that they maintain the ability to operate appropriately, produce what they're supposed to produce, do what they're supposed to do, but at the same time do it safely and securely. And the idea initially came out around understanding first and foremost what was the information we were trying to protect. And so in doing that, they came up with a starting point, taking all the different types of information and activities that are revolved and evolved around these types of systems, and then categorizing them based on their risk. What would happen to the organization if that particular piece of information either was disclosed to the big world somewhere when it shouldn't have been, got changed when it shouldn't have been, and or wasn't there when it was needed as part of those processes. And so that's where the categorization started. Then we would, of course, in their construct, design and select certain types of security components, controls, efforts, policies, procedures, etc. around that we would put together around that protection mechanism. And then we would implement them, we would evaluate them once they were put in to make sure they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And then the agency's risk officer, whoever that might happen to be, would make the selection on whether or not that was secure enough, safe enough for the operation in a federal environment as part of those processes. And then at the end of it, once they did that, they would then monitor the operations while it was running. Well, what we did is we took this idea of these 6 steps that were out there and evaluated where the operational technology components, efforts, activities fit into this. We found 3 of the 6 areas that were relatable very quickly in understanding it, and then developed out a process around the categorization, the baselining of the controls, and then in the selection process, doing the risk evaluation, and then being able to prioritize that selection of the controls in such a way as that they were focused on the OT side as well as the supporting IT side as part of those efforts. We also began to work with the whole process that came along about 6 or 7 years ago around continuous monitoring as part of those efforts, and the fact that they're doing an awful lot of these exact same types of evaluations, exact same types of tests and efforts in order to make sure that the systems are working as it's running appropriately. This led us to then prioritizing the steps that we see in our efforts. And so when we're operating now in a instrumentation world, an understanding of tests and evaluation, we then prioritize these processes. And what we work with is the first steps of categorize, baseline, assess. Then we go to prioritization of the controls. We then allow the organization themselves to implement their control sets, document how they do that, evaluate it, go through their process within their organization for risk acceptance of what they've determined. And then we can enter back and do often enter back into the picture and showing the organization how they can work with that monitoring effort to show that while the equipment's being used, while that activity is running, it's still safe and secure. And so we based everything on the NIST standards that are out there, the guide to risk assessments, the risk management framework guide itself, which are 830 and 837. Then we looked at the controls that were available that are out there, 853 being the large control set that's out there that NIST has produced, 1,100 some odd controls in the current version, Rev 5, and how they are baselined together. We also looked at that continuous monitoring component that NIST has put as part of those processes with their new assessment guide as well. And then we took that IoT industrial control system focus of what they talked about the risks are within 882 and adapted that to working with OT, created and utilized the overlays for the controls from the OT perspective, and then worked with it from those standards. So, of course, the NIST construct has a wide range of areas of coverage, trying to cover all possible options for every type of system that needs to be evaluated. There's 18 families, there's 1,100 odd controls, which of course is phenomenally detailed. There's no way it could possibly be applicable. And so what we did is we adjusted it to the operational technology environment, cut some of the families down so they're not quite so dramatic as we have to work with. We ended up with 13 instead of 20 families that we work with as part of those efforts and looking at these. And these are the 13 that we work with: access, integrity, protection, which is confidentiality, incident response, all those types of things, and left the others to be considered by the organization as they so chose, as they were understanding what their risks were. And so our overview of these efforts was to begin to work from and use the principles of security that are there and work through those, look at the access, look at the vulnerabilities, understand the confidentiality that's found in focus and other NIST documents, working through them, and then prioritize them based upon what we worked with as part of our efforts. So I said there's 1,100 plus controls and 853. We look at and evaluate approximately 700 of those 1,100 initially in our first look. And as we go through them and we begin to prioritize risk, we begin to look at those that have the highest risk, those that work with the most important areas, and that evolves it down to 270 instead of 1,100, which is a lot easier to work with, especially in an automated activity.
All right, so let's get into sort of similar to a case study of how we walk through a typical test equipment cybersecurity assessment. We're going to start off by, as we've identified in latent sort of exposed categorization, talk about the boundaries and the boundary selections, interface identification, go into discussions on software and hardware and inventory, and then finish off with control baseline. But this is not all. We're going to at least talk a little bit about continuous monitoring at the very end. All right, so the first step is categorization, and we saw this on the risk management framework. This is how we understand the priority levels and clear understanding of the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system you're looking at. In some cases, when we're trying to determine the number of controls that we're looking at, we want to have a clear understanding of the use of the instrument or the organization and what levels do you assess yourself at. So at this point, we collect artifacts, we do investigations, and we come up with this evaluation of your data, your components, and then at this point, you as the customer or client make a determination of your risk appetite for the organization, so we can make a good determination on what level that we're looking at. So beyond here is the authorization boundary. First step is to determine what's in scope and what's out of scope. This is from more of a system standpoint, understanding the various components that's within the boundaries, but that does not exclude or eliminate the idea that we have a lot of information that's flowing in through either networks or information that's provided to your test equipment, and signals that are coming out that are testing your unit under test. So this shows just a quick example of an authorization boundary as it applies to test equipment and the inputs and the outputs coming from it. These are the detailed interfaces. Interfaces are important. We have external and internal. The external interfaces, as mentioned, is what's outside of the boundary. So what feeds the different types of data to your test instrument. The internals are the transfer of information between components. And so each of your components may have either software or drivers on those. And in that case, what you're doing is you're monitoring how data is flowing through the actual test equipment and then back out to the unit under test. But from a cyber standpoint, you want to be very clearly understand exactly the type of interfaces that are happening and the type of data that's flowing from the inputs into the output of your system. I mentioned this before, software and hardware. Software is really important. We look at the software side of things very similar to how we assess IT, but the hardware is where we start to get more into the OT area. And this is where we start thinking about the various components that tie together to provide whatever enablement output that you're looking for. This is also where you start to think about where you're getting these components from and secure supply chain and all of the above, so that you're not introducing any vulnerabilities or any undue threats into the overall system that you're building. As a part of the SSP, we're looking at controlling our baseline or a control baseline. This is where we work through an effort of down selecting. When we saw the 1,100 controls that was presented prior, you got to imagine this from a leadership standpoint of trying to identify, well, how long will it take for you to implement all of those controls? How much will it cost, and how many resources are you going to need to implement it? The baselining exercise helps you down select so that you can actually have some sense of organization and management of what you're doing from implementing a mechanism, and who you're using and how much it's going to cost going forward. In this exercise, we went through applicability sort of phases where we started to determine what was applicable between a base control and an enhancement, what has already been implemented, which you'll do through your evaluation of your SSP, what is partially implemented, and in some cases, some things are done, but not quite all, and then what has not been implemented at all. And then we take the partially implemented and the not implemented and use this as a way to determine the final assessment from an SSP standpoint of your base controls and your enhancements. So as we move into more details around which controls are valuable to focus in on, this is where risk modeling and risk assessments come into play, where your SSP gives you a current state of where you are based on the artifacts and the analysis. Risk analysis itself gives you what could happen, and this is also the other side to identify where things, where problems could occur that has not already occurred. In this case, we are looking at automating this risk assessment because, again, we don't know, we don't know. So this has given us at least a knowledge base in the background to use and evaluate what type of risk could traditionally happen in the components that you're assessing or in the software or the drivers that you're using. What we're requiring here is sort of evidence-based model-driven assessment. We're looking at your components and the components that are adaptable to the OT environment. Again, that extensive cybersecurity knowledge base is extremely important. This is where the actual knowledge base is compared against the actual architecture, and you're making determinations on where risk may lie and a clear understanding of your threat tree or your threat modeling. Then this is also providing us an automatic way of looking at and prioritizing controls based on what's identified from a risk standpoint and making sure this remains quick and comprehensive as you go through the process. To enter into sort of this risk modeling exercise, the first thing we're looking at is sort of what are the inputs? So I mentioned architecture a couple of times. There are different ways using this tool created by KDM Analytics called Blade Risk Manager. What we've done here is either you have maybe a traditional architecture, what you see on the left-hand side is sort of an OV1 construct, or you may use a Word template, which will just provide the various interfaces, the components, and all the different connectors that goes within your area. Blade takes in system descriptions, data types, data sensitivities, which is aligned to your sensitivity analysis, information exchanges, and the data flows from one end to the other. Some of the features identified, as you can see from the left hand to the right, we have clear risk or a list of risks from a risk analysis standpoint. It also provides a risk cube, which are possibly used to see. You also have your count distribution or your risk distribution across from a risk analysis area. On the right-hand side, we have the vulnerabilities per risk. So each risk has a number of vulnerabilities tied to it, and this actually gives you closer to understanding where the holes or the problems could lie within your components or your components, your drivers, or your software. Again, additional features are the list of attacks per risk. So not only are we looking at vulnerabilities, but we can look at the various attacks that could occur with that particular risk. And again, the risk are focused primarily on the different types of actions that could occur for that particular component or asset. On the right-hand side, we take those types of attacks, or actually these components, and we actually create what we call an attack graph or attack tree to have a clear understanding of how the attacks can occur so that you can find different ways or develop different ways to either implement countermeasures or reduce the impacts of any of the attacks that are occurring. And then finally, we have our risk cube, as mentioned on the previous slides. This should be very familiar if you're a risk manager. Most organizations have a clear understanding of the likelihood and impacts as it applies to risk. The color coding on your risk cube, if you're not familiar, it's really a good determination of the risk appetite for the organization. So in some organizations, it looks exactly like this. In other organizations, you see a shift of how much red or how much green shows on here. In this case, for this example, we had about 58 risk. And so on the right-hand side, you see our legend or our key for the severity level, where we had about 10 that was very high, 15 that was high, 16 moderate, 16 that was low, and then 1 that was very low. The intent here is to actually implement controls and mechanisms to reduce the amount of risk, which will actually get you to a posture that you and your leadership has agreed is worthwhile. So as a summary, from a risk assessment report standpoint, we are contributing nodes to the risk. So this is one area that we're looking at, focusing in on, really looking at the various attacks that drive the risk itself, any of the exposures and vulnerabilities, identifying the controls that are already applied, and that's from an applicability standpoint. And then from this stance, really look at the controls that have not been applied so that we can actually continue to reduce our risk even more. So as a sort of a recap, as it applies to the risk management framework, the different areas that we focused in on was the classification assessment, which was looking at categorization. We used our security plan, which is the current state assessment of where things are, and then our risk assessment. All this together helps you identify your POAMs, which are your management tools to actually work through the controls and enhancements that are either partially implemented or not implemented at all.
This ends up leading us to the continuous monitoring process, where we look at our selected IT/OT related efforts and work through where do we put in our indicators, where do we put in our monitor points, where do we look at what activities are going on, and then record and evaluate these various events in that activity around those efforts, look at them, evaluate them, and then communicate the risks that are going on once those controls are in place, once those efforts have installed that through the organizational efforts around implementation, assessment, and authorization parts of the risk management framework. This continuous monitoring is about monitoring it when it's actually active. So this leads us to looking through how a continuous monitoring effort puts everything together, starting with defining what's going to be monitored, establishing it all there, putting in those monitor activities around those controls, and then letting them give you that information back so you can analyze on it and you can report on it, and then review and see if you're getting the right readouts that you're expecting to show that it's still within risk tolerance, that the architectural components are still there, they're configured correctly. Is it right? If not, and you take that available threat information, you change the enterprise architecture focus, you then change how the controls are looked at overarchingly, which gives us the wide range of efforts around information security continuous monitoring, which is what ISCM stands for in those areas. Many of these are well understood in, say, for example, the cyber world themselves, like the specifications mechanisms, the security content automation protocol that's available, which is SCAP, the various different automated tools around help desk, MCM, and incident response, and connecting those with an understanding of being able to tailor your output from these efforts, ensuring compliance all the while that you meet all the appropriate cyber regulatory criteria that's out there, so that you can see and you can watch and then you can monitor what's going on with those efforts, whether it's a single dashboard on one device or if it's a whole SIEM effort in a security operations center, in an operational world, even to the point of doing this with software, even to the point of evaluating all these automated mechanisms using today's methodologies of fast, rapid development for these tools and these activities that are in cyber. We see these efforts come into play, whether it's in a dynamic input environment or a dynamic output environment where it's got to go. We can do it through our normal developmental pipelines today, so it all works very quickly.
Thank you, Tony and Leighton. This was great. We really appreciate all that insight. As you can see, we've taken a lot of time and energy to try to find the right solutions in order to enhance the value and benefits in this process. And rather than leaving it up to manual process, we tried to automate things to reduce costs and efficiencies and be able to focus on the analysis and insight and be able to recalculate models and do them dynamically so you can get the most value out of your system. Thanks very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we're here for questions and answers.